you to persuade the government to make more eco-friendly actions?
Great. Well, the first thing I want to do is something you might not expect, which is to say, what is the government? Most people think, and the media acts like the government is Stephen Harper. But no, we live in a democracy. So as a member of Parliament for Sandwich Gulf Islands, I'm part of Parliament, which means I'm part of the government. So the difficulty is, how hard is it to persuade Stephen Harper and his cabinet, which in technical democratic terms is called the Privy Council, that's what they are. How difficult is it to convince them to do things that are eco-friendly? Very, very, very difficult. Because they seem to have, particularly Mr. Harper, has made up his mind that anything to do with protecting the environment is somehow bad for the economy. That's not true. It doesn't make sense. We all know, who've worked in this area for a long time, that the best decisions for the economy are usually also the best decisions for the environment. If you think long-term and you're looking at making sure your country can be successful and sustainable for the long term. So, yeah, can I go to you?
Yeah, you pick up.
Okay, you go again because you have a follow-up. What's your name?
Rowan.
Rowan, okay.
And wouldn't it be true that if there was an oil spill, we would lose much of the profits that the little profits that we make from the oil to actually clean up the spill?
Well, we want to see, okay, so who's the we who makes profits from the oil? The oil industry makes lots of profits. And for instance, British Petroleum had that huge disastrous spill in the Gulf of Mexico, but it was making money again within a few years, and it was profitable. But if you're a trooper fisherman in the Gulf of Mexico, you've lost out every year since because there's no shrimp left. So for British Columbians, we don't make a lot of money out of the idea of putting, well, there's no real benefit to British Columbia as a province in pipelines to put bitumen crude in tankers to go out from Kitimat.
But
there's a big,
yeah,
we have a big risk, and we could potentially lose a lot more jobs that exist in the fisheries and exist in tourism, and that's why I think most British Columbians oppose that project. So we'll go to somebody else with the
Absolutely. Spread it around.
What's your name?
Esiva.
Esiva, what's your question?
What made you so interested in environmental issues?
I really, honestly, I don't know, because it was always just like asking me what made me, I don't know, what made me breathe. I've been interested in environmental issues since I was, my mom said that it was around the time I was talking that I was saying stuff to her, like, I was about 2 years old, and I told her I didn't like airplanes, and I'd never been in one, so she didn't know why I didn't like them, and she said, what don't you like about airplanes? And I said, well, they scratch the sky. So I don't remember saying that. By the time my mom said, I said, so I've just always been concerned. Now, my first active choice to be involved in environmental work was I'm coming up to my anniversary, because April 22nd, 1970 was the first Earth Day we ever had. And I was in grade 10, and I organized in my high school so that we could do lots of stuff on Earth Day. So it's just kind of, I don't know. I really don't know. Don't have a good answer for it. What's your name next to you, please?
Jody.
Jody, okay, what's your question?
Okay. Stephen Harper said to China's government, make no mistake, this is going to happen, referring to the EP. Nor does anyone know if it's going to happen or not. What do you think will happen if the EP doesn't go through? What do you think China's government might do towards Canada?
It's a very, very strong question, and it makes a point that I wish more Canadians had noticed. I think it's quite wrong for our Prime Minister to tell a foreign government that a project is going to go ahead while we're still having public hearings where the evidence isn't in, and besides, all the First Nations oppose it along the pipeline route. But there's another level of government that hasn't said clearly yet what we think, and that's the BC government. So if the British Columbia government says no, is the Prime Minister going to say to China, well, I promised China, so you don't have any say in Canada, because the Chinese state enterprises, Sinopec and PetroChina, they've bought up a lot of oil sands operations. They want to put their bitumen crude in pipelines to take it to Chinese pipelines, to Chinese tankers, to Chinese refineries. I don't think China will really care that much in terms of your question is what will China say to Canada? China's got, Sinopec is one Chinese company, just to give you an example. Sinopec is the 5th largest company in the world. Not just the 5th largest oil company, it's the 5th largest company in the world. It buys the majority of oil from Iran. Well, other countries aren't buying from Iran. China has lots of places that China gets oil. China buys from Syria, from the Assad regime. China's got lots of places, and if they can't get the bitumen crude through pipelines to Kitimat, they'll just get the bitumen crude from Keystone Pipeline to the Gulf of Mexico and out on a tanker. It's more about what do Canadians say to a prime minister who tells them this is going ahead because I've promised Beijing before I bothered to listen to you. Now I'm going to go to this side. What's your name?
Emma.
Emma, okay.
On a recent trip to China, Prime Minister Harper said to the Chinese investors that the pipeline was going to be built. Do you think that the protests against the Northern Gateway pipeline will have an impact on the federal government's position on the pipeline being built? If so, how or why not?
Boy, you guys, I wish you were in Ottawa asking questions in question period. So far, by the way, I'm the only member of Parliament who keeps raising questions about the extent of Chinese ownership in the oil sands and the failure of the Government of Canada to apply any national security checks on what it means to have state-owned enterprises from China buying up so much of the oil sands. I think in terms of how will the protests affect Stephen Harper? No. So I might as well tell you something. I usually don't tell schools because but I really think we have to remind ourselves that we live in a democracy. And in that democracy, 308 members of Parliament are the government. And we can choose, in theory, we can choose a prime minister among ourselves. That's the reality of our parliamentary system under Westminster parliamentary democracy, is that the prime minister is first among equals, and all of us as MPs are supposed to be equal. So in my view, the more that the prime minister ignores the view of Canadians, it may not have an effect on him, but we have to start being able to say, just the way Gordon Campbell, when he went with the HST, which he never told British Columbians about, became so unpopular that he left being premier. I think Stephen Harper has to leave being prime minister because he's going too far and against the will of Canadians. Yes, in the front row. What's your name? Chris, go for it.
Yeah, I was thinking, why don't the Canada government, make a bridge from DC to China? And I think that the government of Canada can afford it. So why do people trying to say that they will happen, that oil spill will happen? Why don't they believe that it won't happen?
Well, I think most British Columbians know that oil spills are a big risk on our coastline. For a lot of people, because I work in Ottawa now being a member of Parliament, and I read, you read the Globe and Mail or the National Post or the papers in the middle of the country, they don't notice that there's a difference between, say, the Atlantic Canadian ocean waters and the British Columbia ocean waters. And there really is a big difference. The Hecate Strait, for instance, that the supertankers would have to go through, is, according to Environment Canada, is the fourth most dangerous body of water on the world. So why do people think it's going to be safe? Because they just don't know. They're not looking at the evidence, they're not looking at the information, they're not looking at the size of the supertankers and the fact that they can't stop fast. It takes several kilometers for a supertanker to put on its brakes and stop. And you've got lots of obstructions through those waters, and then you've got the route up the fjords to Kitimat. I think British Columbians and people who know our waters say, no way are we going to do that. That's why we put a moratorium in place in 1972. And we've got a real education job for people who don't understand the difference. And I still think we can educate people to understand the difference. And maybe not Stephen Harper, but other people who are willing to listen. Yes, young lady there. What's your name?
Emily.
Emily, go for it.
In our class, we've been talking about the profit versus environmental concerns. But if the pipeline leaks, then wouldn't it affect both?
Excellent question. I wish that we had, before the assumption that most of the people, and if you read the newspapers, it'll say, well, there's the concerns for the economy, and that wants the pipeline built. Then there's the concerns for the environment, and that wants the pipeline not built. But even leaving aside the environment for a minute, here's the case on the economy that it doesn't make sense to build the pipeline. The pipeline is to ship out bitumen crude, which is not yet processed. If we were to refine the bitumen crude in Canada, according to the labor unions that work in this industry, would create about 45,000 jobs in Canada. So, and then there's the other economic issue is, does Canada have, I don't know how many of you looked at Canada's overall energy situation. We know we export a lot of oil, but we also import a lot of oil. Not in Western Canada, but all the Atlantic provinces and Quebec and Ontario depend on oil from Angola and Nigeria and Venezuela and Norway and Kazakhstan, because the Alberta oil is primarily being shipped out. Right now it's primarily being shipped south to the US, and now Harper wants to ship it west to China. But what about shipping it east to the rest of Canada I was actually, believe it or not, I was in an environmental, well, it was a natural resources committee of the House of Commons, listening to experts about pipelines and refineries, just on the question of capacity and where the industry is strong and whether the refineries in Canada will keep operating. And one of the MPs asked, and it was the executive from Suncor who answered the question, what would happen if the OPEC nations stopped sending oil to Eastern Canada? What would happen to the rest of Canadians from Ontario east? He said, oh, it's no problem at all. We'd just load a super tanker and we'd send it down through the Panama Canal, and then it could come up and it would bring the oil to Eastern Canada. So that's not really much of a good energy plan, I don't think. So when you look at the economics of this, I honestly do not believe that even leaving out the risks of oil spills and disasters on the pipeline route, economically and in the Canadian interest, the pipeline is a mistake. It ships out jobs and it leaves most Canadians without access to local energy. The best solution would be, of course, to stop growth in the tar sands and hold it to what it is now and gradually phase out our dependence on fossil fuels. Before I go to you again, Rowan, I'm just going to go to the back there. What's your name?
Anna.
Anna.
Hi. We need jobs, and the Canadian economy relies on exporting natural resources. Isn't the construction of these pipelines supposed to benefit Canadians?
So there again, the jobs issue, a lot of British Columbians have been upset for a long time when raw logs are exported, because we could get more jobs by producing a finished product. Same thing with the oil. If we're shipping out bitumen crude as fast as possible, number one, we're risking the jobs that exist in BC in tourism and fishery. Those jobs depend on having an ecosystem that isn't full of oil. You're not going to get tourists coming to beaches that are covered in oil, and you're not going to be able to fish, just as in the Gulf of Mexico with the BP oil disaster. So we have a risk to existing jobs, but we're also giving up jobs we could have in further refining of the products. So I'll go to you. What's your name? Sam, go for it.
How would transferring to alternative energy and fuel affect our economy?
Repeat the question.
How would transferring from fossil fuels to renewables affect our economy? Well, if you do it in the right ways, it's actually, of course, going to be good for our economy. You have to consider one of the problems with one of the problems with the way our economy works is that we put a price on only some things. So dumping pollution into the atmosphere, treating the atmosphere as a waste dump, is counted as if it's free. But it's not really free. There's big costs to doing that. There's costs locally in bad air quality and people going to hospital. And that's the case for provinces that use coal for electricity. That's one of the reasons the Ontario government has a commitment in Ontario to shut down their coal-fired power plants. Locally, it causes people to go to hospital more because of bad air quality. But it also costs us in terms of climate change. And sea level rise and more droughts and more natural disasters because of climate change will cost our economy too. So the shift to renewables should be something where we start with, by the way, I don't know if you cover how much we need energy conservation. We waste more than half the energy we use in Canada. So if you look at the 100% of energy we use, more than half of what we use is just wasted because we built our economy, our buildings and our transportation infrastructure around the idea that energy was cheap and abundant. So going to renewables is a long-term smart thing to do, but it needs to be coupled with energy efficiency and the right tools like feed-in tariffs and things that you may have heard about already, given how well informed you all are.
Can I just wait for a second?
Sorry.
What is our timing on this?
We still have about 8 minutes.
8 minutes, and you're on. Teacher, sorry.
Yeah. Well, I think the question I heard was, what are there ways to educate the Chinese government about our concerns so that they will take those into account? I mean, we have to bear in mind that our government is a democracy. China's is not. China is essentially controlled economy run through the Communist Party of China. Having said that, China's done more on climate change than Canada has. We actually, believe it or not, we don't need to educate the Chinese government about the threats of the climate crisis. In international meetings, China clearly understands it, and in their economic stimulus package in the face of the recession, China put, I think it was 400 billion, but it may have been 600 billion into renewable energy and trying to get its economy less dependent on fossil fuels. That said, China's building new coal plants, has a huge amount of coal, but China's government's actually very concerned about the impact on China of the climate crisis. For instance, the Tibetan Plateau is the water tower of Asia, and the ice on the Tibetan Plateau feeds the 5 major rivers of Asia, on which about 2 billion people depend for water. So China's actually, in a very strange way, at its centrally controlled Chinese Communist Party level, it's aware of climate change and I think making long-term plans to figure out how to deal with it. But they're really not concerned about what Canadian people think. The sad part is that our Prime Minister doesn't seem to be concerned about what Canadian people think. And between a Chinese communist superpower on the other side of the Pacific and our own government that we elect, I'd like to think we could get Stephen Harper to pay attention to what British Columbians think.
We have time for 2 more questions, so you can pick.
Wow, oh, that's really tough. You on the back shelf.
Okay, if like you averted the crisis and you stopped the exploitation of the tar sands, how would we be able to like compensate for the loss of energy that we could have had? Like what other sources could we use?
Well, we wouldn't actually, bear in mind that the oil sands so far are for export, and we are exporting into both the U.S. economy, which is very wasteful, and if we use it domestically, our own economy is very wasteful. So to stop the expansion of the oil sands and to shift away from dependence on fossil fuels and coal-burning power plants, Canada can have an energy strategy that actually is better for our economy while reducing the environmental impacts and creating more jobs. If we went out and, for instance, retrofitted the buildings across Canada that are pouring energy to the outside, I mean, most of the buildings in Canada in winter are heating the outdoors, right? We don't need to heat the outdoors. We need to put in better insulation, better furnaces. All of that will create way more jobs than we now have, and those jobs are across the country, whereas the oil sands jobs are localized in northern Alberta. So my last question, I have to go to Rowan because he's desperate.
I think what we need to do to stop the pipeline is to get people in British Columbia who those people had no gain in the matter, maybe like a couple $100.
Yeah.
But we need to get them educated about the pipeline and about the matter that we have nothing to gain, but we have everything to lose.
Yes, I want to vote for you. Here's the thing, this is Earth Day weekend coming up. I don't know how many of you and your families are already planning to come to the legislature at 10:30 on Saturday for a rally. It's going to involve Bob McDonald from Forks and Quarks and some other good speakers. And so that's at the legislature at 10:30, and then at noon there's an Earth Walk, and it's all fun and it's going to be really great. And if any of you are willing to get your parents to drive you up to Sydney, where I live, at 6 o'clock on Saturday night at Mary Winster Center, and Arthur Black from Basic Black on radio, he's going to be the MC. And the whole program is about educating ourselves so that we understand the dangers of the tankers, the pipeline routes, and how we're going to stop it. But if everybody gets together, kids, parents, teachers, politicians, experts, and we all say, and First Nations people, and everybody, and fishermen, and we just say, what about no doesn't Mr. Harper understand? We're saying no in British Columbia. And I'll say no on your behalf in Ottawa, which I do a lot, and I explain these issues to MPs. The good news is I just want to say one thing quick before I done. Members of Parliament are regular people. And my goal in Parliament is to get Conservatives and Liberals and New Democrats and Bloc and all of us together to start talking about issues together and get them to be willing to say to their own party bosses, you're wrong, we need to protect BC coastlines, you're wrong, we need climate action plans. So I really feel as though reaching out to individual MPs, I'm able to do something that people in other parties haven't tried so far. And I'm very encouraged, by how much you guys know about the issue and how committed you are to protecting British Columbia from oil tankers. Thanks a million.